Hello, everybody. Today we are going to be focusing on settler colonialism again and looking at that set of issues from the perspective of federal recognition. Now, in this image here, I have a picture from a protest organized by the Chinook tribe of Indians as part of their efforts to get federal recognition. But this is a set of issues that is extremely widespread. It is particularly significant in California because of the particular history of this area. And it is also very significant out east, where you have a different set of cultural ideas, which is that after removal, which is a set of policies in the 1830s, or the Trail of Tears, that this created an underlying assumption in the eastern United States that Native peoples had all removed out west to Oklahoma Territory, that Native folks weren't there anymore. Now, this is a really tricky set of issues for many indigenous nations today who are struggling to get federal recognition. So we're going to be looking at the implications, the impacts that many of the issues we've discussed in the last modules, has had on Native American nations today, particularly ideas that were ideas from the 1800s about Indian disappearance, romantic stereotypes in mass media and writings, as well as the racial laws that the United States has enacted and the ways in which racial concepts, understandings of race from the 1800s made it into the documentary record and created a system of silences in terms of what is even written down that has negative consequences for many Native tribes today seeking to be recognized by the federal government. We'll also talk about how narrow constructions of what it means to be a tribe have had the same kind of impact on Native folks today, particularly in California. Now, I said that this was an issue particularly salient in California and the eastern United States, but it's also global in nature. So we'll be looking at Native American peoples in North America specifically, but this is a global issue for indigenous peoples. What are the regimes through which indigenous peoples can be recognized and have their rights as indigenous peoples recognized by nation states? So we'll build on the critique of settler colonialism. Last module I told you that I was outlining a classical definition of settler colonialism. Now we're going to look at contemporary interventions in that definition, which emphasize liberal forms of settler colonialism. Liberal forms that operate not only through elimination, although they still do that too, that is an ongoing factor, but also through these kinds of bureaucratic regimes of recognition. Who can be recognized as Native American in the eyes of the state that grants rights, that honors treaty rights in this case? I have several examples for you that we can talk about. And in this image right here, I just have for you a map of indigenous territory at different parts of North American history. So starting in 1492, when the entire area that is currently the United States was native territory. By 1790, you see settler encroachment on the eastern seaboard. This is specifically British colonies, or I suppose 1790, we're at the United States in its early formation. 1830, that date corresponds to the Indian Removal Act. This was a piece of legislation signed by Andrew Jackson, in which he forcibly removed Native American nations out west. This includes the Trail of Tears. That's the most famous case of removal. And the federal law, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, was passed in 1830, but prior to that, Andrew Jackson had already removed the Creek or Muskogee Nation from what is currently Georgia, Alabama, and northern Florida. So in many ways, this process starts earlier in the 1820s. And when we talk about removal, these are death marches, right? I forget the numbers. I think it's like 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 people in the marches would die, tended to die. Mostly we're talking about children and elders, which means the knowledge holders and the next generation. Really big hits. And by 1890, you have the essential form of the map that we have today, where indigenous territory is further reduced to reservations. Now, there are many factors of this land dispossession, right? And we've talked about many of them. One of those factors is the regulations through which indigenous peoples are either recognized by the United States, and thereby the United States recognizes that nation-to-nation agreement. It recognizes treaty rights. It recognizes rights to land held in trust, meaning a reservation, and other kinds of rights, hunting and fishing rights, educational resources, medical resources. Access to language, access to funds that are appropriated by Congress for language revitalization efforts, scholarships, all kinds of things. And so this question of who is recognizable by the United States and who is unrecognizable is an important aspect of how settler colonial power operates in our world, and how settler colonialism is able to reproduce itself on a daily basis. Now, I have a kind of silly example for you, but I came across it a couple weeks ago, and it really made me think about Gino Breen's book about firsting and lasting. Because I was watching WWE Raw, because I love WWE Raw, and I'm recording this in 2025, right after Stephanie Vaquer won the Women's Intercontinental Championship title. And on Raw, Stephanie Vaquer appeared with her father, clearly not media trained, but I imagine she must have negotiated for him to be there. As she is billed in this show as the first Latin American Intercontinental Women's Champion in WWE. And this was this really big narrative, right? She's the first Latin American champion. And when I first heard that language and the announcers kept repeating it, I was initially confused. Because in my mind, when I hear that kind of thing, what I hear is that prior to this point, there had not been any Latin American Intercontinental Women's Champions. And I was confused why the WWE would be treating this as a point of pride. Why would you take pride in the fact that you have never had a Latin American champion before? Wouldn't that instead be a sign of discrimination, which you would be trying to rectify? Why would you celebrate it? But as I thought about it more, I realized that this is part of a larger narrative that we often hear within the multiculturalist United States. And I'm going to critique multiculturalism, but not from a neo-fascist perspective. I have a different critique of it. My critique of it is the ways in which it doesn't go far enough. including the ways in which multiculturalism leaves settler colonialism uninterrogated and undismantled. So anywho, there's this narrative, right? The first Latin American champion, the first black woman billionaire, the first whatever. And I realized as I was thinking about this, that this is the exact same thing that Jean O'Brien was talking about when she spoke about firsting. It's just a multicultural version of firsting. And I realized that this tells us something really important and interesting about liberal forms of settler colonialism. Because in order to be recognized, and being a champion, having that championship belt is a form of recognition. To be recognized and to belong in that kind of settler community, the WWE is international, but it is Raw is based in the United States, as far as I can tell. I'm not a... Yeah, anyway. To join that sense of belonging within a settler state, that sense of community, even within a multicultural frame, you do so by performing the exact same settler colonial moves that we saw in previous eras. So firsting now becomes a practice of creating belonging and recognition and identity within a multiculturalist state. So the message, right, when we hear language like, oh, first women's international intercontinental champion from Latin America, right, when we hear that kind of language of firsting, what this is about reproducing settler colonial logics in a multicultural context and creating a kind of identity as a good person, a good liberal citizen within a multiculturalist world. Look, we can recognize first Latina in this position, or Latin American woman specifically in this position. And we're back to firsting. Because belonging in the settler state requires the performance of settler colonial tropes, including firsting, lasting, and replacing. Now, I showed you this slide briefly, right? In the classical definition of settler colonialism, you have dispossession and elimination. Those are the two pillars of the concept. But increasingly, scholars in indigenous studies are writing about additional mechanisms that settler colonialism uses to reproduce that relation of dispossession, including recognition. Because the United States government will recognize native tribes. It will honor treaty rights in some cases. To some extent, I should say, not usually a lot. It will provide resources, again, like education, scholarships, monies for language revitalization. But that happens through a bureaucratic logic in which many indigenous peoples are unrecognized and potentially unrecognizable within the government logics of the settler state. And this is where a lot of new scholarship is taking us. Now, this matter of recognition really has come into salience since the 1970s, following the legal wins of the Red Power movement in that period. However, you can go back much further. You can look at the Indian Land Claims Commission in the 1900s, early 1900s, which sought to evaluate which indigenous nations would be given, or which were entitled to land as a result of illegal actions by the United States, or treaties, or things like that. And I'll say that one of the expert witnesses often called by this commission was Alfred Kroeber, an anthropologist at the University of Berkeley, whose name will come up at a few different points in this semester, so I feel like I might as well flag it. Very prominent anthropologist, one of the first anthropologists in North America, trained under Franz Boas in the American School of Anthropology, if that's a field you're familiar with. If not, don't worry about it. And he sets up, in fact, he's commonly known as the father of anthropology in California. Kroeber is, I mean. And so these critiques that I'm mentioning, really, really lovely books, although a bit dense, include Glenn Coulthard's work, Red Skin's White Mask, and Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus. Now, Glenn Coulthard is a Diné man, Canada Diné, not Navajo Diné. So, and his argument, right, is he's looking at Diné history, including the history by where the nation tried to assert self-determination in many different ways, including a syndicalist model of economic production, meaning worker-controlled factories that were organized by unions rather than bosses, as well as other kinds of things, including extending the reach of their jurisdiction, their governance, to include non-native peoples on their territory. Now, Canada really didn't like this. It did not like the Diné Nation governing non-native people, and it did not like the Diné Nation adopting an economic model, a socialist economic model, rather than a capitalist one. And so, this is a long story in the book, but essentially Canada undermined and disrupted those efforts, disallowing those forms of social organization, that expression of governance and economic self-determination. Now remember, with tribal nations, right, these are governments. These are not just, like we often think about Native American identity as a racial category, but what we're really thinking about here are, at different points in time and in different contexts, citizenship within multicultural and multiracial nations. Indigenous nations have been multicultural and multiracial since before the arrival of Europeans, and multiracial since. Because it was not strange or odd to incorporate outsiders into your community for Native folks. Another framework that often comes up is family or kinship, right? We're looking at kinship systems because family structure is a really important part of indigenous governance, historically. So Glenn Coulthard makes the argument based on his analysis of this historical process, this historical event, in which he says that the way federal recognition works is that it functions by enticing, that's his word, enticing Native American peoples or nations, government entities, into accepting and embracing limited cultural rights. And in doing so, the settler state creates the sense that it is legitimate, that it is just, that it is righting historical wrongs by extending rights to Native nations, while simultaneously reproducing that fundamental logic, that fundamental relation of dispossession, while maintaining that dispossessed land base that is the foundation of the settler society. So this is how a settler society is able to reproduce itself within a liberal mode in which the settler government is creating a performance, and I think in many ways bureaucrats are honestly and legitimately trying to do good work where they're righting historical wrongs and making a more just world. But what it ends up accomplishing, right, is the continued reproduction of a settler colonial organization of society premised on a relationship of dispossession. Indigenous land is dispossessed. That becomes the land base of the settler society that is built as a mechanism of replacing indigenous societies. This is a kind of logic of inclusion. Indigenous peoples can be included in the settler state in new ways, while without dismantling the underlying system of settler colonialism. That's why I call it liberal settler colonialism. It's not outright genocide. It's not even forced assimilation, which was liberal for that time period. I'm not saying it was good or anything. It was extremely violent. I'm actually saying that liberal policies reproduce extraordinary levels of violence, as do conservative ones, because that's how settler states operate. It's not it's not Democrats versus Republicans. The second book I want to talk about is Audra Simpson's Mohawk Interruptus. This is a great book about the Mohawk Nation, which exists on the border between Canada and the United States. And they actually have three separate governments in the Mohawk Nation. There's the government recognized by the United States on the U.S. side of the reservation. There's the government recognized by Canada on the Canadian side of the reservation. And then there's a third government that calls itself the traditional government that is based on older Haudenosaunee or Iroquois legal frameworks, including the Great Law of Peace, which we'll come back to later. This is a kind of legal framework that comes out of indigenous oral traditions in this area that form the basis of confederacies and the confederation of several different tribes into the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Nation. And that traditional government tends to operate, it's more on a council basis rather than by creating the institutional kinds of structures that are what tribes have to do to obtain recognition, right? You have to organize your government on a basis that is recognizable to the United States, right? Where's your Department of Natural Resources? Where's your Department of Education? Things like that. And the tribal government says, no, we're going to do it our own way. And so Audra Simpson develops this concept of refusal. What she means by that is an indigenous refusal is a moment where indigenous peoples refuse recognition on terms set by the settler state. So the tribal government, the traditional government says, we are refusing those terms of recognition that say we need to adopt a governmental philosophy, a political philosophy and model based on the European nation states, and instead we're going to do this other thing based on our traditions. Another great example that she talks about is a moment where the Iroquois lacrosse team is traveling to the World Championships. Now, lacrosse is based on a Native American game of stickball. It is based on a game that has been played by Iroquois people and their ancestors for, at least 1,000 years. And when the Iroquois team attempted to travel to, I think this was in England, to attend and participate in the championships, they were denied entry because they were attempting to travel on Mohawk Nation passports. And at that point, Canada stepped in and the United States stepped in and they said, hey, we'll issue you emergency passports. We want y'all to play in this game. We want you to play in these championships. We'll give you emergency passports. And the team said, no. We are a sovereign nation. We are a sovereign people. And we will enter into Europe, into England, with our sovereign nation's passports, with our Mohawk passports, or we will not enter at all. And so in that moment, the team refuses to be recognized on the terms of the settler states, instead insisting on deeper levels of sovereignty And so here we start to see these kinds of mechanisms of what I'm calling liberal settler colonialism and regimes of recognition. What are the rules that govern? What are the bureaucratic, in many cases, rules or cultural rules that govern who is recognized and who is unrecognizable? Now, one example that is local to here is the Muwekma Ohlone tribe right here in the Bay Area. The Muwekma are federally unrecognized. They do not have federal recognition, and they've been fighting for it. They were denied recognition by the BIA, and the optional reading tells a little bit about that history. And there's this really interesting case, right? I mean, I just love these photos, right? In which Muwekma people organized this protest, right? Over the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. So this was a protest last year in 2024, and it's what they called it the Trail of Truth. And many folks rode on horseback, right? And you can see how their outfits and what they're wearing and the paraphernalia signal Native American identity. Even the horses signal Native American identity. Because remember Tom King's point, right? Like, hey, if I created a photo of Native artists, how are people going to know that they're Native? How do people know that Will Rogers is Native if they don't live up to the stereotypes that were created of us? Well, in protests, you got to don on the apparatus that everyday people in the area or in the nation will be able to look at you and recognize you as Native American, whether or not the state does. So, it's a really interesting, I just love these photos. There's so much going on. Now, there's many aspects, there's many dynamics in the Muwekma case regarding the federal recognition process. But one of them is an analysis by the anthropologist I mentioned earlier, Alfred Kroeber. Now, Kroeber wrote a lot about many different Native American peoples in the area. And many of the folks he wrote about have federal recognition in large part because of the documentary record that he created in the early 1900s. He also had a lot of personal conflicts with other anthropologists, and so they just tried to avoid each other. And one effect of that is that if you ended up when they shuffled who they would do research on, if you ended up not getting Lowy, you may not have had you had somebody who did research with you, but they may not have published as much. So that can end up being a barrier for people today. But in the Muwekma case, what Lowy wrote was that the tribe is for all intents and purposes extinct. Now, as you can see here are Muwekma people. They are clearly not extinct. But what Kroeber meant by that was that the nation did not have a tribal form of organization based on his anthropological understanding of that. That they had lost these aspects that for him were essential. This is his framework, right? That they lost these aspects that were what he considered authentic Native American identity and tribal organization. And he had an anthropological framework, right? A tribe means X, Y, and Z, and it's seen as a stage in the evolution of societies from foraging bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states. Now, that's an old framework. Anthropologists today will generally tell you that it is not a particularly helpful one. It's a little, because it erases so much of people's histories, and it just doesn't, take an anthropology class if you want to deconstruct that model. Anywho, right? And now when I say those four criteria, bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, that's actually a later concept in anthropology, but it's a good example because even though Lowy wasn't using that precise language, that's the underlying set of assumptions, that there's a linear evolution of societies and that a tribe is a universal stage or a universal form of social organization that can be applied cross-culturally. So his question becomes not, what is Muwekma life like today? What is organization like today? Instead, it is, are they an authentic Native American people based on my understanding of what that means as an anthropologist? And the answer for him was no. And so when the BIA considered their recognition case, what they decided was in part based on this piece of writing from Kroeber. They said, oh no, you're extinct. That's what the documentary record says. That's the history. Now I have a few examples for you in addition to the one you read about with the Nipmuc Nation. The first one is the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Mashpee folks, this is the tribe that their ancestors were the first people to meet the Pilgrims. They're still around, but they were not fairly recognized until the last decade or so. And in the 1970s, there was a court case by the Mashpee tribe seeking to obtain rights to lands that were slotted for development. And so what came up in that court case, right, was the question of recognition. Does the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, are they a Native American nation? Are they a Native American tribe entitled to those kinds of land rights? Or are they not? And the way that court the way that court case went through in the 1970s, they brought in a lot of expert witnesses, a lot of anthropologists, and they asked the anthropologists, what's a tribe? And the anthropologist gave them an anthropological definition and then said, what if a tribe doesn't meet that definition? Now, by this point, anthropologists had learned from many of the mistakes of people like Kroeber before. And so they didn't want, and so they were thinking very carefully and said like, hey, yeah, no, if a tribe doesn't meet our definition, if an indigenous nation doesn't meet our definition of what a tribe is, that actually makes it a really interesting case that we want to study and understand on its own terms. But that wasn't an intelligible answer in the context of a court system, because the courts had to determine, is the Mashpee tribe a tribe or not? And so the resulting decision was that the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe was denied federal recognition. And the court evaluated tribal history at several different historical dates and compared that historical information to those limited definitions of what a tribe is. Now, what they found was that at the time of the Pilgrims, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe was absolutely a tribe. And today, or at that point in time, in the 1970s, the Mashpee were indeed a tribe. But in the 1920s, a moment that corresponded to an important piece of federal legislation, the Indian Reorganization Act, the 1930s, the Indian Reorganization Act, which created the legal basis for the modern system of tribal government and recognition. In many ways, this was a really positive law in that it reversed centuries of colonial policies and enhanced indigenous peoples' sovereignty or their ability to self-govern in really important ways. But like many laws, it also has unintended consequences and limitations, such as the issues of recognition we're seeing today. So anyway, the court said at that point in time in the 1930s, the Mashpee Wampanoag were not a tribe. They did not meet a definition of tribal organization. And so it's this really interesting legal fiction. How can you be a Native American nation in the 1600s and in the 1970s, but not in the 1930s? How does a nation disappear from existence and then reappear? It's a legal fiction, but a powerful one. And it's arrived at by the process whereby states evaluate indigenous nations according to the legal criteria of what a Native American tribe must be or is, as outlined by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or BIA. Oh, and by the way, the Mashpee tribe has been continuing this fight for a long time. They were granted federal recognition status, I want to say in 2015 or 2016. There was some complicated proceedings as Trump attempted to revoke that in his first presidency. Mashpee peoples have fought against those decisions and reestablished their rights. It's a complicated, ongoing situation. Many Native American tribes in Virginia were recently recognized in the last 10 years as well. And there's an interesting story behind there, right? So part of the story that I've been telling has been about the creation of historical records and the silences embedded in the historical record in terms of colonial and anthropological categories and government categories of what is a tribe. And do these people that we are evaluating measure up to that definition at all the necessary points in the historical record? Another piece that enters into this, as O'Brien points out, are colonial ideas of race in the 1800s and early 1900s. Assumptions about what race is and how it works that informed settlers' perspectives, that Native folks today were often not really or authentically Native American because they were mixed race. We see that in the Nipmuc case and we see it in the Virginia case because in 1924, the state of Virginia passes the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This is a Jim Crow bill. And what it does is it reorganizes the racial categories of Virginia on the census. Now there are two categories. You were either white or you were colored. Again, that's the language of the time. This is Jim Crow. Which meant that Native American folks in the area were reclassified in the written records not as Native American, but colored. And in fact, many people in Virginia today many non-Native peoples think that Native folks in Virginia are not really Native, they're actually black, is the line. And that is in many ways a piece of this history. Now, of course, Native folks have been bringing outsiders into their communities for many years. Many Native folks in Virginia have black ancestors as well as white ancestors. That doesn't make them less Native American. Because again, Native American belonging is a political category, a citizenship category within tribal nations that are multicultural and multi-ethnic and multiracial. Now, one little detail, a little side note worth mentioning, is that part of the Racial Integrity Act included what is called the Pocahontas exception. What this said was that if you have a certain fraction of Native American ancestry but otherwise have European ancestry, you are European. And I always forget how the numbers break down. I think it started off as like 1/16th Native American in 1924, and then there was an amendment that changed it to 1/32nd, but it may have been the other way around. It might have started at 1/32nd and then moved to 1/16th. It doesn't really matter either way. It's not an important detail. And so the reason why this was important in Virginia was that, many wealthy Virginians were trying to claim historically, before this act, status equivalent to their aristocratic peers in Europe. They wanted to be seen as aristocrats. And one way that they did that was by claiming ancestry, white folks claiming ancestry to Pocahontas. Because Pocahontas was seen at the time as an Indian princess, thereby royalty, thereby title, aristocratic identity. And so it was really important that these laws did not sanction those wealthy white families who have been claiming descendancy from Pocahontas and maintained their legal status as white. So we see the emergence of two completely distinct ways of recognizing race. You have the one-drop rule. If you have one drop of black blood, that's the metaphor of the time, black blood, then if you have any black ancestors in your family tree, you are considered black. But you can have fractions of Native identity and be considered white. Now, these pieces create challenges for Native folks today, right, including in the federal recognition process. Because, again, they were written out of the historical record, including the census. And my last example for you is the Nipmuc Nation. Here's a picture of Mary Vickers, and also the front page of the Earl Report of 1861. And as you read, right, the Nipmuc Nation tries to obtain federal recognition from the BIA, and the BIA denies the petition. And Ray Gould, a native archaeologist, a native Nipmuc archaeologist, focuses specifically on the treatment of Mary Vickers as a way of illuminating how the silences in the historical record impact Native folks today, impact the Nipmuc Nation today. So in 1861, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts commissions Earl to go around, travel across the state, the Commonwealth, and document all the Native folks in the area. The government is saying, hey, we need to know who the Native folks are so we can properly govern those populations. We need that information. Earl, give us that information. And Earl attempts to do so, although he does complain that one thing, for example, is it's very hard to track down people because they're moving all the time. So he has a hard time finding them, and he can't find everyone. Because, the Massachusetts Commonwealth, the government, wants to account for people, which means fixing people in place. But people are actually moving. Because Nipmuc people at this point in time were often wage workers. So they would often be traveling between cities in the Northeast in order to do their work and make a living. You can think of this kind of thing the same way that when you move from one state to another, you have to change your address with the government, you have to get a new license, you have to do all of that bureaucratic paperwork so the government can track your movement. For whatever reason, and we can go deeper into this if y'all want, nation states function by attempting to know populations. They know populations through studies like the Earl Report, and they want to know populations in order to govern, to rationally govern them with whatever idea of rationality is dominant at the time. So this is an important mechanism in all nation states, right, is tracking people's movements. And because Nipmuc folks are so mobile, because they are nomadic, that creates a problem for that settler government. And so Earl complains, and he ultimately doesn't find anything. Find everyone. He does find many things. He does talk to many people. He does not talk to everyone. And when it comes to Vickers in particular, Earl classifies her as a, quote, miscellaneous Indian. This is a term of his creation, and it is based in the racial ideas, the racial belief systems of the United States in this point in time, in the 1800s. Because he says, Vickers and people like her, they have ancestry, they have parentage from many different native tribes. So they aren't part of one tribe, they are miscellaneous, they are mixed. They are mixed race. Now, fast forward to contemporary times. As the BIA considers the Nipmuc Nation's federal recognition case, they look at the Earl Report, they look at these historical documents, and they say, hey, The written record, the history we have, says that these people you're claiming are your Nipmuc ancestors are not themselves Nipmuc. They're miscellaneous Indians. The historical record doesn't say anything about them being Nipmuc at all. Now, Gould's counterpoint to that, right, is that we have to understand indigenous peoples' reckonings of identity and kinship. Because in most Native American nations, with a couple exceptions, one of them being the Shawnee Nation, but overwhelmingly in North America, your belonging, your tribe and your nation, your clan and your family are all given to you through your mother. Your father, or the person we often think of as your father, is not historically always super significant as a father figure. Because again, you're getting your identity and you inherit property from your mother's side, not your dad's side. So if your mom is Turtle Clan, you're going to be Turtle Clan, and that tells you who your family is. Your dad is actually not your family, and your dad's family is also not necessarily your family. And if you want to ask who would be that kind of quote-unquote father figure role, as we think of it today in the United States, that role would actually have fallen to your mother's brother, meaning your uncle. The person who impregnated your dad is just that. The person who impregnated your dad. Maybe he's a fun buddy, closer to what we would probably say today as an uncle role. Anywho, all of that context is to say, based on Nipmuc understandings of identity, ways of recognizing belonging and identity, Vickers is Nipmuc because her mother was Nipmuc, and her mother's mother was Nipmuc. And that's how it works. Regardless, right? The federal government, the BIA, says the historical records say that this woman is miscellaneous Indian, and they do not say that she's Nipmuc. So that silence in the historical record, which is based on Earl's assumptions about race and identity, at that point in time, continued to reverberate in terms of U.S. policy today. Now I'll leave you there for this module. We've done some heavy lifting so far. Great job.